It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the immaculate John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably John Hersey. How you doing this morning, John?
I'm doing good. We're getting some light snow here in the Northeast. I'm in Massachusetts. You're in New York. And I can't complain. We've gotten worse this year, but I feel for those people in parts of the country that are getting hammered and just don't know how to deal with this stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah, and in Texas, I think is the worst winter storm that they've had in like a century. And there's a lot of power outages. And the temperature in Houston was like, I don't know, it was in single digits Fahrenheit, wasn't it? Like 3 degrees or 5 degrees or something. I mean, that's unheard of in Houston when you're that far south. So it's clearly just another case of global warming, John.
Yes, it's clearly the problem is global warming. We've got to fix this global warming problem. It's terrible.
Well,
But
well,
anyway,
AOC knows how to do that, right? So we don't have to worry.
yes, we can definitely
But
rely on the
but
Green New
go
Deal to
ahead.
take care of all our problems.
Yes,
Yes, yes, yes.
yes, absolutely. All right, so uh, we have a monumental figure in the history of science to discuss today, don't we?
Absolutely.
The
I was thinking though just a minute ago, if you don't mind my going on a tangent for just a second. This
Yeah,
is
go ahead.
episode number 35. So we've now done nearly 3 dozen historic figures, just inspiring, enlightening people that we can learn from. We've done, dozens of these episodes that if you're just tuning in for the first time, you can check these out in your favorite podcast app. And while you're there, we'd much appreciate a 5-star review. But yes, so Galileo, right? Galileo Galilei
Yeah,
is who
yeah.
we've got for you today.
The immortal Galileo, his dates 1564 to 1642. There he is, the great man himself. And Galileo is often considered a transition figure between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Notice that he dies, I'm sorry, Galileo was born in the year 1564, which is the year Michelangelo, our hero from last week, the hero for all time. Michelangelo died in 1564, so that's as good a date as any to end the Renaissance, right? Michelangelo's gone, no more Renaissance. So Galileo is born in 1564, which, by the way, just as an aside, was the year Shakespeare was born. Also, somebody for a future hero episode. But Galileo dies in 1642, which is the year Isaac Newton was born, one of the heroes of science that we've already discussed on the show. So Galileo's a major figure, in the age of reason, and often considered, like I said, a conduit or a connecting figure between the Enlightenment and between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. So yeah, Galileo's achievements in science, of course, make him an immortal. I mean, his achievements in a number of different scientific fields.
He's also almost a perfect contemporary to Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, another one of the great fathers of modernity who we've talked about on this show.
Right,
So yeah, I
right.
mean his developments in astronomy and physics they just cannot be overstated. They're monumentally important in the development of the sciences.
And I was reading about his life yesterday, and it's interesting. His father was a musician, right? He played the
Yeah.
lute and everything. And I didn't know this. I was interested to learn that Galileo, learned to play the lute from his father, and also learned evidently a healthy skepticism towards authority, which is a
Absolutely.
nice, yeah, it's a nice quality to have. I wonder if he exercised it toward his father. Since when you're a kid,
Yeah.
your father's an authority figure in your life, but he certainly
Yeah.
exercised it towards the church in his life, didn't he?
Yeah, and I think his father was definitely a positive influence in several respects. Vincenzo Galilei, he was a composer and a musician, but he was more than that. He was scientifically curious and he wanted to understand the nature of sound. He also thought that the church music of the time was very, very sterile. And so he did what he could to begin to revive interest in Greek myths and poetry and to translate these into a musical form. And some say that he was sort of the starting figure of what became Italian opera. But
Really?
yeah, that's what I've read. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Well, his father's dates. I don't know them, off the top of my head. But his father's dates he'd make him a Renaissance figure, and that way he'd be a contemporary of Michelangelo.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he died a little after Michelangelo, but roughly contemporary. Yeah, his Galileo continued to play music throughout much of his life. He was a lute player, and his interest in music and his interest in science from this early age are cited as influences on his own scientific thinking. But I think the most formative influence is the one you mentioned. And if I could, I just want to read a quote from Vincenzo that I think really brings us into the household that Galileo grew up in. It's really
Yeah,
interesting.
great,
He said,
great. Go ahead.
"It appears to me that those who rely simply on the weight of authority to prove any assertion, without searching out the arguments to support it, act absurdly. I wish to question freely and answer freely without any sort of adulation. That well becomes any who are sincere in the search for truth."
Nice,
Beautiful word.
nice.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Excellent. And we discussed when we were discussing Leonardo the positive qualities of the studio system that had such felicitous effects in Renaissance Italy. And Galileo, not quite the studio system, but he studied with a tutor for a number of years when he was young, right? And that's a related quality or related activity of I want to extol the virtues of a mentoring system. If a family can afford it, rather than send your kids in the United States today, send your kids to the government schools, which are atrocious. To have a mentor, and we've seen the benefits of that on the show when we discussed the great achievements of Vivian Thomas, who couldn't go to medical school, during the Depression, but was hired by a great surgeon, and was mentored by, what's his name, Alfred, or I forget his
Blaylock. Alfred Blaylock.
Blaylock, right? Yeah, Alfred Blaylock, right, at Vanderbilt, right, and then later at Johns
Mhm.
Hopkins. So the mentoring system is an outstanding way to get an education, and I think Galileo had a tutor for a number of years before they sent him off to some Catholic abbey to complete his education. Am I remembering that correctly, John? I think that's what it
Catholic
was.
Abbey. Oh, Galileo's education. He
Yeah,
attended the
yeah,
University of Pisa for a while, but he could not afford to complete his degree. But like you said, when he left, or actually before he left, his father was able to get him a position under a court mathematician, the Tuscan court, I believe, under Ricci. Not sure how you pronounce his name exactly, but you're absolutely right. He was able, and science benefits just as much as art does from this sort of mentoring system. Sort of
yeah.
reminding me of my own experience at the Objective Standard, where I'm a associate editor. For the last 4 years, I've got to learn from people like you, and of course Craig Biddle, the editor of the Objective Standard, how to write and edit. I'm learning way more than I could have
Sure.
ever learned in any other sort of system. It's great.
Yeah,
But
yeah, and no, and I would, like I said, recommend it to parents, especially given the breakdown of the American educational system. And also just as since I published that essay in TOS that you edited, John, on American education, which I'm developing into
great
a
essay.
yeah, thank you, to a full length book, but. Uh, Mentors can be gotten, I think, just we're off on a tangent. We'll come back to Galileo in a second, but it's an important tangent. Mentors can be gotten today, I think, relatively inexpensively, because say you have graduate students getting a PhD in chemistry or in literature or in mathematics or whatever. As graduate students, they usually don't have a lot of money, one, so you could get them relatively inexpensively. Two, they're studying the subject. They're not taking education courses. They're studying chemistry. They're studying literature. They're studying mathematics, not education. They know the subject. And three, with the technology, you could be working remote. My good friend Melanie Hoffman in Minnesota hired me to tutor her kids in philosophy, And so and I come relatively cheaply. So the mentoring
And you're not
system
even a grad
today,
student. You're a doctorate.
right? Yeah, exactly. The mentoring system today, I hope, will become more and more widespread as parents recognize the educational system is one, doesn't educate, and two, if it does anything, it indoctrinates the kids with leftist propaganda. But be that as it may, Galileo certainly profits from the mentoring system and having a tutor for a number of years when in his youth. I just wanted to say before we go on to his scientific career, though, something that tickled me was that Galileo was a pious Catholic his entire life, but he fathered three illegitimate children. So I don't remember his mistress's name or his girlfriend's name, but three illegitimate children. Say, way to go, Galileo. He wasn't like Michelangelo. He wasn't a monk, who did, a monk of work who did nothing else. So I'm glad he, if he didn't marry, I'm glad he had a girlfriend, at least, and had the pleasures of romantic love in his life.
Marina Gamba, she was, I believe, 21 or 22 when they met. He was something like 34, 36. And yeah, they had several kids and apparently were in love, but they weren't on the same social strata. And so marriage was, I guess, frowned upon. Ridiculous, of course, as were many things at this time. One of the things I think we should talk about, though, is we talked about the similarity between the background or the mentor system that benefited both Leonardo and Michelangelo and also Galileo, as we'll talk about. But one important difference is that the end of the Renaissance is the end of the Renaissance, I think, for good reason. It marks the beginning, at least in Italy, of the counter-reformation. The Reformation, or the response rather of the Catholic Church against the Protestant Reformation. So whereas Michelangelo and Leonardo had, they benefited from a fairly lenient Catholicism, Italy started to take a sharp turn back to sort of conservative religious orthodoxy during Galileo's time. And this began, the typical historic marker for this is the beginning of the Council of Trent in 1545. And that council would go on to pass many edicts that, when enforced, would really stifle art and science. And so Galileo is born at the wrong time for sure, because he was a very, very outspoken independent thinker, and would not censor or rather tone down his thoughts just because of what others thought about him. So anyway, I wanted to set that context that we're dealing here with the Counter-Reformation and the increasing grasp of the Catholic Church on all aspects of life.
That's a really good point, John, especially given the chronology of who we've been discussing here: Leonardo, Michelangelo, Galileo, right? For 3 weeks in a row. So I was just, as you were speaking, I was just thinking, one, Giorgio Vasari, the great biographer of Renaissance artists, said Leonardo was more of a philosopher than he was a Christian. And so Leonardo checked out at the right time. 1519, he died, so he didn't have to feel the wrath of the church for that. And Michelangelo, in the Last Judgment, where he depicts Jesus not only as this rugged, manly specimen, but he paints Jesus and the Virgin Mary nude. I mean, so is able to get away with that, although the church watchdogs covered up the genitalia, as we discussed last week. But he was able to get away with that, without all that much hardship afflicted on him. But Galileo's not able to escape the church watchdog so easily post Council of Trent, as you said. So that's a good historic context to set. So should we discuss Galileo? I mean, Galileo's an immortal scientist. So obviously we're here to discuss him because of his scientific achievements. So where should we begin?
Yeah.
There's so many of them. With the
I
telescope,
would say that
or
we should start
even
with,
before that?
his probably the most famous story of him, he's a medical student, and as you said, his father wanted him to go into the church, or rather he wanted to go into the church, and his father actually talked him out of it. He said you should study medicine. And so in 1580 he begins attending medical school. And the following year, I'm sure you remember this one, while he's sitting in a cathedral in Pisa, what does he see?
Right. Oh, is it the falling objects you're talking about from the Leaning
Yeah,
Tower of Pisa?
he's sitting in the cathedral there. An attendant goes to light a lamp suspended from the ceiling, but he's got to draw it towards him to light it.
Oh, the
So he does. He
pendulum. Yeah,
lights
the
it.
swinging pendulum. Right.
Yes, and this I think
Right.
sets
Yeah.
off. Uh, Go ahead.
Yeah. Galileo noticed that no matter how far the pendulum swung, it took the same amount of time to complete one arc. So which was interesting, and I think it's like 100 years later that insight became the basis of the first, really accurate timepiece that was chronometer. That was, is that chronometer the word? But the first really accurate timepiece about 100 years later.
Yeah, he put measurement to this. So he put his hand to his throat and measured it by his pulse, and was able to say, okay, well, it was let go from this height, and even though it doesn't rise to the same height in subsequent arcs, it does always complete the period in the same amount of time. And W.T. Jones, in his History of Western Philosophy, has a really I think, great observation on this. He says, all this had happened thousands of times and had been observed by thousands of young men without issue. It was characteristic of Galileo that he did not merely look, he also counted. And what he discovered when he counted was a pattern of regularity, a pattern that might never have been known had he not conceived of the idea of translating the qualitative succession into quantities. So this observation of
Yeah.
the arc is, and the swinging of the pendulum, is a jumping off point for lots of his later research and discoveries in physics.
Right, right. While you were speaking, John, two things came to my mind. One, the one fictional hero we've done on the show is the immortal Sherlock Holmes. And what does Sherlock Holmes say to Watson and other people? You observe, but you do not understand, or something. I don't remember
Yeah.
the exact, the exact quote. So W.T. Jones making a good point. Lots of people had seen that or observed it, but weren't thinking, of what it means. They didn't measure it. And then two, of course, one of Galileo's immortal contributions to science is the quantification of it, the emphasis on mathematics, which smacked to some people of going back to the Pythagoreans, who were a combination of brilliant, in the ancient world, who were a combination of brilliant mathematics with a good deal of mysticism. But Galileo understood that once you quantify physics, you make it much more rigorous. A qualitative approach to science would be what a simple kid from Brooklyn example. So my car, how much does it weigh? Oh, well, it's heavy. Says okay, relative to other things, that's true. But if we say, well, it's 2,567.4 pounds, that's a lot more precise. That gives us much greater knowledge. The quantitative approach to science is much more precise than a qualitative approach, and Galileo was one of the first to understand that and emphasize it.
So in 1589, so actually in his mid 20s, he begins publishing some tracts. Publishes a tract in his mid 20s, extends some of the findings of Archimedes. And a few years later, he's able to land a position as the chair of mathematics at the University of Pisa. But Galileo always told it like it was, and he would certainly be out of step with today's cancel culture and political correctness. He was very
Oh yeah.
tactless in criticizing some of his peers at the university, and also in demonstrating the falsity of scholastic dogmas about motion, which is very brutally honest with people. And it didn't take too long for him to get kicked out of the university and find
He got
himself
canceled.
jobless
He
for a
got
while.
canceled, John. Cancel culture goes back to the 16th century. Who knew, right?
Absolutely,
It's not
yeah.
funny. This, yeah, it's not funny. But yeah, he did make a lot of enemies. The Jesuits, interesting. They're an educational organization within the church, and many of the Jesuit professors, the priests, are very well educated, and interested in science and in this thing. And Galileo engaged in a heated dispute with some of them on various scientific issues. And you're right; he was not diplomatic in his criticism of that. He made enemies, amongst the powerful Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. That's for sure.
Yeah, he certainly did, and some of the Jesuits said that, well, all he had to do was play nice, and he would have been able to write and do whatever sort of scientific work he wanted, but he just was not very tactful in going about it. But I don't think that this should be a criticism of Galileo, and I'm sure we're on the same page on this. Is freedom of speech, freedom to think; those two things are the basis of civil society, and if you don't have that, you can't have you can't make scientific breakthroughs, or those who do make scientific breakthroughs are, as we'll see, persecuted. So
Yeah, and before we get into the really important scientific work, and starting with the telescope and then going on to many other things, there's an interesting moral point here, and that is, if somebody you disagree with is adult, and you call them adult, that's certainly honest. It's brutally honest, as you said. But there's something to be said for a more diplomatic, approach for focusing on the content and treating your opponent, with gentleness, or treating your opponent respectfully, and but never see you 100% commitment to the truth does not necessitate calling people names, even if those names are deserved. you, and you wonder if Galileo were brutally honest regarding the content of his thought, but respectful and diplomatic towards his opponents. You wonder if things would have been different. I don't know. That's a counterfactual. There's no way to know. But I do think people should think about being respectful in their disagreement, speaking the truth, stand up for the truth, 100% the truth, 100% of the time. But this, regarding the content issues, I think a point here is not all truths have to be stated. If so and so is dishonest, or so and so is not too intelligent, there may be context where that doesn't need to be mentioned. But the content, whether it's discussing science or philosophy or politics, the content of it has to be stated, and it can be done, I think, respectfully.
yeah, I haven't read all of Galileo's writings, but I know that what I have read, he's primarily focused on the content. It's just that he, as we'll get into in some of his dialogues, he gives the opinions of some of the people even some of his friends, but he gives their opinions that he doesn't agree with, to the characters with demeaning names. One of them being Simplicio. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about
Yeah,
simpleton, essentially.
yeah. That's in the dialogues concerning what two chief world system. I think was the title of that work. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
major work. So
actually,
should we
the
discuss
three.
the telescope? The
Let's
telescope. I
do it.
mean, that's yeah. Let's do it. I mean, the first telescope that I know of was created by a Dutchman, and what was his name? I wrote it down. Hans Lippershey. And according to the stories I've read, Galileo has hearsay about it, and then
Yeah.
develops his own with a three times magnification that one he uses to study the heavenly bodies, but two, being an entrepreneurial sort of guy, he made money as a side business selling his telescope to merchants, who used
Hmm.
it, who found it useful at sea, for example, as a spyglass, and such. But it's interesting that, and it's very positive that I like that, Galileo had a capitalistic entrepreneurial side to his personality, and made money selling his telescope to merchants.
Yeah, he was always interested in the practical applications of his discoveries. In fact, when he moves to the University of Padua in 1592, shortly thereafter, he's hard pressed for cash, and he develops it's called a compass, but it did more than what we would think a modern compass could do. It was also some sort of primitive adding machine that was extremely helpful to people in the building trades and all sorts of merchants. So he sold that as well to make extra money on the side. And he was quite the pioneering capitalist, not only a scientist, but he united the businessman and the scientist in one person.
Yeah,
But
and
yeah,
that's outstanding. That's outstanding, and certainly, he used the telescope. I mean, I think eventually he designed one that had a 30 times magnification, and he used it to study the surface of the moon and made some discoveries about the elevation of the mountains, and that the moon wasn't this perfect sphere of Aristotelian belief that had been rigidified into dogma by the scholastics. And Galileo, a number of things I read about Galileo over the years, that always impressed me, is how impressed he was by evidence, that he was always willing to change his mind based on observational facts. And I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, but there's a quote from Galileo. It's when I quoted in one of my TOS essays, going back a number of years. I don't remember the exact wording, but where he says that when Galileo was in conflict with these Christian Aristotelians, with the scholastics, who were just took Aristotle's content as dogma and overlooked Aristotle rejected Aristotle's observation-based method. And Galileo said something, to the effect that Aristotle, with his overriding respect for evidence, would look through the telescope, and see the evidence, that you guys don't want to acknowledge. So the telescope is a great device to sharpen human empirical abilities, right? It enables us to observe things that we can't observe with the naked eye. And then Galileo used it for exactly that purpose.
yeah, he heard about this telescope made by a Dutchman. He never saw models, as far as I'm aware, and he knew enough about optics to go ahead and build his own. And he did so. And in 1610, he used it to observe the mountains on the moon, the moons of Jupiter. This was extremely controversial, because the people in the church believed that there were only 7 heavenly bodies, and that this number 7 was sacred, that it had all these ties uh, to scripture. And Galileo will say, well, yeah, just look through my telescope and you'll see that there are satellites of Jupiter. There are moons surrounding it. And they refused to. And this is kind of a funny quote, kind of sad, but this comes from one of his colleagues at Padua. He said, "There are 7 windows given to animals in the domicile of the head. From this and many other similarities in nature, such as the 7 metals, etc., which it were tedious to enumerate, we gather that the number of planets is necessarily 7. Moreover, these alleged satellites of Jupiter are invisible to the naked eye and therefore can exercise no influence on the Earth, and therefore would be useless, and therefore do not exist. Besides, from the
Oh,
earliest times of men," I mean, it just gets worse. It's hilarious. It's just this reasoning, and it
wait,
reminds me of that Sherlock quote. "It's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." I mean, also going back to
yeah,
Sherlock. I mean, this is lunacy.
yeah. The reasoning there was just atrocious, you know. Uh, and this is in the 16th or 17th century. I mean, don't forget the one work of Aristotle that had not been lost during the early Middle Ages and Dark Ages was his works in logic. So they knew something about Aristotle's logic, even going back to the Dark Ages, long before this. This is terrible reasoning. I mean, that's just atrocious. But yeah, I mean, Galileo's identification was it? I think you're right. It was 1610, right? Of the 4 moons of Jupiter. Was a revolution in astronomy, back then, because Aristotle had held that all heavenly bodies circled the Earth. And here, like we said, the scholastics had, ossified into dogma, like as if it was stated by Jesus or Paul or one of the church fathers. And here, Galileo shows empirically that there are moons that are circling not the Earth, but they're circling Jupiter. And so you have the empirical data for that. And anybody who's convinced by empirical data is willing to look through the telescope. This causes a revolution in the field of astronomy in the 17th century.
Yeah, and so in the same year, 1610, he published his the Sidereal Messenger with these observations. Met with some pretty stern criticism, but is not at this point rebuked by the church. The following year, 1611, he uses his telescope to document the fact that these spots in the sun that others had looked at, some had studied these, but they had concluded that these were bodies perhaps orbiting the sun, and there would be, there were not actually on the face of the sun. And Galileo refutes this. He publishes his finding in 1613 to the great dismay of the church members, who held that these spots tarnished the perfection of this heavenly body of the sun, and so that it cannot be that these spots on the sun are actually on the sun. It can't be that they're imperfections. It has to be that they are that Galileo is again mistaken.
Right, right. Again, using Aristotle's beliefs that were formulated in the 4th century BC. Before telescopes or a great deal of knowledge, in many fields, and taking it was. I mean, look. In my judgment, Aristotle's the greatest philosopher in history, and we know today he's one of the, along with Darwin, one of the greatest biologists of history. We've done hero episodes on both Aristotle and Darwin. But first of all, nobody's infallible. Not even Aristotle, and certainly somebody speculated in the 4th century BC. Before there was observational data on a lot of these issues. So the authoritarianism of the Catholic Church. This is the mentality. We have an orthodoxy. We have an orthodoxy in religion. We have an orthodoxy now, from Aristotle in philosophy. And you toe the line. You simply accept it, or else, or else you're going to be in trouble. And Galileo was taught by his father to have a critical attitude towards authority. And facts, right? Just the facts, ma'am. To quote that old TV show Dragnet. And Galileo, with his overriding respect for evidence, keeps pushing the truth here based on observation. And by the way, I just want to make a philosophic point. The cardinals of the church, who tend to be very educated men, they're not ignorant Bible thumpers and backwoods Bible beaters somewhere. They tend to be very educated. Galileo wants them to look through the telescope, look at the empirical data. They refuse to do it. And I'll ask my students, well, why won't the cardinals do it? And they're obstinate, they're stubborn, they don't want to admit that they're wrong, all of which may be true. But there's a theological reason here. The claim is, especially in regards to the Copernican theory, which we're going to discuss. The claim is that there's scriptural evidence, that the earth stands still. The story of Joshua, for instance, the sun's moving across the sky and God stops it in its motion. There's scriptural evidence for this, and the Bible is the word of God. And so the cardinal's attitude was, Galileo, if your telescope shows us evidence that contradicts the word of God, then who openly clashes with God? Satan. And if your telescope shows us evidence going against the word of God, then your telescope is a satanic device, and we cannot approach it for fear of our souls. That our souls will be in any intercourse with the devil. Our souls will be condemned to everlasting perdition. Now, from a rational secular point of view, this is just bizarre. But this is Catholic orthodoxy. And the cardinals are acting in accordance with their religious principles. And unfortunately, their principles are faith-based and irrational. But they're afraid. They're afraid of their souls being condemned to perdition to hell for the rest of eternity. That's the deepest reason why they refuse to look through the telescope or embrace any of the empirical data that Galileo adduces in support of his conclusions. Religion is hazardous to your health. I've said that many times. Religion's an irrational philosophy. And here we see a good example of it.
Absolutely, yeah, and it wasn't the case that everybody in the church was against Galileo and his views. There were actually some sympathetic people, and we'll talk about one of them who became pope. But in 1613, a Dominican friar named Father Niccolo Lorini actually preached a sermon against Copernicus and also against Galileo, and he reprimanded Galileo for his ideas. And a couple of years later, he actually got a hold of a copy of a letter that Galileo had written to a friend, explaining how it was that we could have both religion and science. And he altered this document. He cooked up his own version of it. He altered some of the wording to make it more damning and sent it to the inquisitors, to the Roman Inquisition. Galileo went to he went to Rome to argue with theologians and try to campaign for his worldview, and unfortunately only succeeded in consolidating the opposition against him. And in 1616, the church condemned the Copernican system, the idea that the the Earth moves around the sun, the heliocentric view of the universe, that the sun is the center of the universe, in favor of the geocentric position, the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. They condemned this position. They added Copernicus's books and all others that said that the Earth moved to a list of illegal books. And they forced Galileo to sign a document saying that he would no longer hold or defend the idea that the Earth moves around the sun and that the sun is stationary. So he was forced under threat to sign this thing.
Right.
I've read too that at the same time, a second memo was produced and filed along with all this, one that Galileo didn't sign, in which he also agreed not to even teach or describe the Copernican system. But as we'll see, this is not something that he was even aware of existing, never mind agreeing to.
Yeah. Today is February 19th, right? So a week from today is February 26th. That's the anniversary, February 26th, 1616. So was that 405 years that Galileo was ordered to, quote, abandon completely the opinion that the sun stands still at the center of the world and that the earth moves. And you're right. He was forbidden to hold this view, teach it, write it, speak it, anything. You just shut up, Galileo. You can't talk about it. Well, shut up on this issue. You can't talk about this issue. And it's fascinating to me, as a philosopher, the tension is too weak a word, conflict between cognition, the advances in knowledge, and religion. We haven't discussed the golden age of Islam, on this show, John. And I think we should do an episode. We should do an episode, on some of the great, some of the great thinkers, of the golden age of Islam. Maybe Averroes in particular, who Thomas Aquinas considered the commentator on Aristotle, and Manuel is a medical man and a philosopher, and answered Al-Ghazali's criticisms of philosophy. But it's fascinating. The golden age of Islam lasted for several centuries. Under Islamic aegis, Islam was the foundation of the culture, and finally Islam crushes it. And we see here under Catholicism the same conflict where there's a lot of interest in science. We have to give the devil their due, or the angels, in this case, give the angels their due. There's a lot of interest in science amongst devout Muslims during the Golden Age, amongst devout Catholics, during the Renaissance and the Age of Reason. But ultimately, faith is the enemy. Ultimately, faith crunches it. You see, ultimately, faith takes precedence here and suppresses the advances. But it just caused me. I put forth the controversial thesis that religion is less evil. Controversial to many objectives, that religion is less evil than collectivism. Because there's no similar fascination with science and advances in cognition under the communists or Nazis, except to create weapons of war, that we see under Catholicism or even under Islam. So, but that's another topic for another day. But it was saying fairness to the church here. You're right. There's a great deal of interest in real science amongst the cardinals and the Pope and all these educated leaders of the church. But ultimately, your philosophy dominates what you do, and their philosophy was faith-based. Their philosophy was Catholicism, just like in the golden age of Islam. The dominant philosophy was Islam, and ultimately crushed the great advances. And so, religion may be, even if I'm right, religion may be less evil than National Socialism or communism. But that's damning somebody with faint praise, isn't it? At the end of the day, they still, you're not as bad as Stalin. Yeah. But at the end of the day, they forbade Galileo to speak out in any way, shape, or form in support of the Copernican theory, the heliocentric theory in astronomy. Let me say something.
Galileo.
John, listen, jump in for a second. I think it was in 1993. 1993. So, Galileo, of course, called before the Inquisition in 1633. So it's 360 years later. I think it was in 1993. The church came out with the pronouncement that Galileo might have been correct in his assessment. They said maybe take its neck out. So they said it was possible that Galileo, might have been correct. They said something like that. And I mentioned that to a Catholic, a former Catholic, who I knew, and she said to me, "You see," she said, "if you just give the church enough time, it eventually starts to come around to the truth." 360 years. Yeah, right. Took them 360 years to figure out that it was possible Galileo might have been correct in supporting the Copernican theory in astronomy. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, John. Go ahead.
Oh, well. That's a very, very important point. Thank you for making that. And it also made me laugh hysterically. But I was saying it. You pointed out that Galileo got into conflicts with several prominent members of the Jesuits, and in one of these cases, it was about the course of comets and the path of comets and the nature of comets. The, style, different works. Actually, there was a lot of back and forth between him and these disputants on the nature of comets. And again, drew attention to his views and drew some ire to himself. But that wasn't the worst of it. In 1623, his friend Maffeo Barberini becomes Pope Urban VIII, and at that point, well, my friend is in power. I can continue to do what I do. I'm going to continue to try to explain my system to people. And Pope Urban had come up with an objection to Galileo, just a suggestion. He said, well, it's possible that God could have created a universe such that the earth appeared to move, while in fact it does not. And so Galileo at this point is dead set on proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the earth moves. And for this, he turned his attention to the nature of the ocean's tides. And so he's arguing that the movement of the earth is what causes the ocean's tides. We know that the ocean tides are actually caused by the moon's gravity. But he spends several years working on this book, and in 1632, and again called up in front
Yeah,
of
it's
the
not the most
Inquisition.
diplomatic way to present these points, is it?
Absolutely
When
not.
you deal with the Pope, and two, who was your buddy, and and supporter. But it's really fascinating, John, because the church told him, go ahead, and write this book, and everything, but don't advocate for you could present Copernicus's ideas, but don't advocate them. Give a balanced account. Now, of course, it's suppressing. It's telling a scientist what he cannot do, and it's suppressing the quest for truth. I can't help but keep comparing or contrasting it with the 20th century collectivists. I mean, what Hitler or Stalin would have had him do had he held ideas counter to the National Socialists or communists. But anyhow, be that as it may, you're right. So Galileo says he tried to do it, but he didn't try very hard. He didn't try very hard, did he? Because Simplicio, the simpleton, as you accurately put it, is defending the old Aristotelian Ptolemaic view, the geocentric view, and he looks like a fool. Galileo makes him look like a fool, and many times he's caught up in contradictions, and he says things that just don't make any sense. And he's clearly advocating for the Copernican theory of in astronomy, in conflict with what the church had told him, and what he had at least some superficially had agreed to do. So it's inevitable at this point that he's going to be called into conflict with the Inquisition, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The 70-year-old man hauled up in front of the Inquisition. He is forced to recant under threat of torture, and so he does, and he's placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. This after some negotiation. He was going to be jailed, and was able to negotiate just being placed under house arrest. Some say that this is a somewhat fortunate progression of events, because Galileo then turned his attention to some of the experiments that he had done back in the early 1600s, some of the work that he had done at the University of Padua. And now here
John, let me jump in for a second, if you don't mind.
Please,
because yeah, thank you. Because we should mention the legend, that has persisted for centuries. That when he was condemned, that he muttered under his breath, and yet it moves, or still it moves, or something like that. Like he muttered to himself that, well, no, the Earth is moving, the Earth is revolving around the sun. Now we don't know whether this legend is true or apocryphal, but I think it shows us there's an important philosophic point, and that is whether Galileo muttered that to himself or not. He probably thought it, because he's got all his evidence. He's got all his evidence to support it. And what's he got against it except nothing but threats? So I doubt it changed his mind. And it goes back to Ayn Rand's point here, epistemologically. You can't force a mind. The mind thinks as it will. The rational mind thinks as it will. It'll go by the evidence. But what you can do with the initiation of force is you can make a person's thinking irrelevant to his actions. He can't act on this anymore. He can't write about it. He can't publish on it. He can't speak about it. He can't lecture about it. He can't talk to people, and advocate it in any way, shape, or form. But you can't change somebody's mind, by force. But also, it's an important point. Also, another thing is, we know today that the Pope, as you pointed out very nicely, Galileo's old buddy, the Pope had instructed the Inquisition: you could threaten Galileo with torture, you could show him the instruments of torture, but you are under no circumstances to lay your hands, upon Galileo. Now Galileo didn't know that. He didn't know that they could threaten him, but was forbade by the Pope to actually torture him. And so he did. They say discretion is the better part of valor, John. He did exactly what I would have done. I said, yeah. If they were going to torture me, put me on the rack. I said, yeah. You're right. I've just had an epiphany. Of course, the Earth is the center. The sun revolves around it. Yeah, I would have done the same thing rather than have them torture me, and just know the truth in my mind. But
Yeah,
I'm
this is
I'm
not a
I'm
case in
sorry.
which forfeiting his life would have made really any difference, and actually would have made a difference in the to posterity, given that we wouldn't have got his amazing tract on physics, his
Right.
his uh, his work on physics that went into the uniformity of motion and the tensile strength of different materials, his dialogues concerning two new sciences, which
Right.
really this Copernicus and Kepler had done a lot in terms of discovering the uniformity of motion among celestial bodies. And this is where Galileo steps up and he finds patterns of uniformity among terrestrial bodies as well. Really lays the groundwork for Isaac Newton, who would come after him and put all of this stuff together.
Indeed, born in the year Galileo died. So it's like there's the torch, and fascinating also that Galileo's last great work, the two new sciences that you're referring to, was smuggled out of Italy to escape the censors and was published in Holland, right? I think it was published in Holland, and a number of intellectual historians point out that this is one symbolic, and two, maybe more than symbolic, might be literal, that the uh, the center of European scientific development passes from Southern Europe and Italy to Northern Europe, to Holland, Germany, and definitely Great Britain. And in other words, from the Catholic world to the Protestant world. And what you were talking about before, very aptly, about the Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation, and the suppressive reaction, on the by the church towards Protestantism, stifles Catholic thought in Southern Europe more than the Protestants, or the Protestant denominations, are stifling independent thinking in Northern Europe. And we see that actions have consequences, and suppressing scientists and writers and artists, has consequences. And fortunately, the Protestants, although they often have their own bizarre set of ideas, and in the United States, some of the Protestant denominations are notorious for ignorant Bible thumping, and later on opposing evolution and everything. But at this point, certainly in Northern Europe, during the Enlightenment, and in Britain's North American colonies, we see greater freedom of intellectual expression, greater freedom of thinking, and we see the great advances made by Protestants in Northern Europe and in North America.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to point out one of Galileo's effects. And I think another is that he taught that the types of questions, never mind the answers, but even just the types of questions that these scholastic dogmatists were asking were trivial and meaningless. They had no connection to life. And so he taught men to not be satisfied by these castles built in the air, actually to look at reality, to ask questions, and to demand answers through scientific experimentation. And really
Right.
set the stage for all of the science to come.
Right, and yeah, and you pointed out nicely that he's almost perfectly contemporaneous with Francis Bacon. And the emphasis on induction, the emphasis on observation. And of course Galileo's emphasis on mathematics and experimentation. Between the two of them, I don't think it's a stretch to say that they lay the foundations for modern science.
Absolutely. Both of them were great fathers of modernity. I think we pointed out in the episode on Francis Bacon that he was spot on in his emphasis on induction. Now, some of Baconian induction is not a method that really ever gained much traction. I think that of all the scientists and thinkers that I can think of, the one that was probably most married to it that comes to mind is John Locke. He really thought that induction required this just enormous bank of instances, and that is an important piece. You need lots of observations before you can generalize, but if you go into it with a hypothesis, then you can look for the specific observations that you need. You can create situations, create experiments that give rise to the observations that you need to prove your hypothesis. And so, marrying these two things, Galileo and Bacon, this is together they make up this foundation of modernity. And without them, we probably wouldn't have the great science that we do today, the great science and technology that we all rely on.
Right. Now, the emphasis on observation, of course, comes from Aristotle, who was brilliant in this regard. But we pointed out several times that the Christian Aristotelians, rejected Aristotle's method and just took his content as though it came from one of the church fathers. It was part of Catholic orthodoxy and dogma. But the real innovations here, with Bacon and Galileo, to distinguish modern science from science before that. The science has been practiced in many parts of the world, going back for centuries at least. But modern science, of course, characterized by experimental method and by mathematical analysis. Those are the two things that distinguish modern science from science in other parts of the world, or earlier in time, and that enable modern science to make the enormous advances that it has. And Galileo is a big part of that. Galileo and Bacon, big part of that.
Well, one of my favorite Galileo quotes that I'd like to end on here, for me at least, is, "It is surely harmful to souls to make it a heresy to believe what is proved." Absolutely true.
Wow, that's brilliant. So that's brilliant. It's harmful to your soul. He's saying, he's right back at you. He's right in your face, to the Catholic Orthodox. You care about human souls? Well, it's harmful to somebody's soul to force them to give up what's been established by evidence. Well, that's brilliantly said by Galileo. Well, John, I think we have done the great man, justice, and excoriated his enemies, even somewhat generous to his enemies by saying they're not as bad as the communists or Nazis. With those two philosophic systems, and the people who followed it would do to dissidents who put forth controversial ideas that clashed, with the collectivist principles. So he might have even been a little overly generous with Galileo's enemies. Nevertheless, Galileo is a true giant and hero in the history of science, and stand against, like Socrates, standing for even more, broader than science, standing for independent cognition. He's a symbol of the independent mind standing up to authority, and presenting what's true. And in time, of course, his ideas won out and the church was shown to be mistaken. So I want to salute Galileo, his genius and his heroic stature, his courage. And I want to wish you, thank you, Galileo, for your work. We absolutely admire you. And I want to wish you, John, and everybody out there in Hero Land, have a more heroic day.
You too, Andy.